Hi, everybody. Welcome to Still Rose's podcast. This podcast was created for women by women to elevate women's voices. I am very excited to introduce you to our guest today, Becky Upchurch. Becky is a mindset coach who specializes in helping people create lives they love by saying no to the things they don't without fear or guilt, creating space to pursue their goals and do more of what lights them up. Becky, you already know how excited I am to have you here. Welcome to the show. I think the wisdom that you're about to impart on us, I think is going to be pretty significant for a lot of women out there. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. I am super excited to be here. This is a topic that I am very passionate about. And I saw when I was kind of getting to know who you were and learning about your work, just your work in elevating women's voices. And I think about that in terms of having women on your show, but also opening the door for women to use their voices, which to me, this is kind of what this speaks to, because many of us were taught to use our voices to say yes as we smile. And I think there's a lot of other ways that we can use our voices. So hopefully we can talk about that today.
Yes. And I have to tell you, I'm especially interested in this line here that says, creating a life that you love by saying no to things, because that in itself, we can unpack for like 3 to 4 hours. But Becky, before you go into it, because I have a lot for you to talk about here. How did you get your start here? Like what inspired you to go into coaching? How did you get your start there?
So I actually came to coaching through the world of academia. I was a classroom teacher and I left the classroom to become an instructional coach. And I actually love instructional coaching. And that was where I did my first coach training. And then I had the realization of, coaching is great in the world of education, but there is so much applicability in life and other spheres. And that's what led me to enrolling in an ICF accredited coach training program and starting my company. And it's been quite an interesting journey. And then most recently is when I had this epiphany actually last year. I can't remember if I was on a coaching call listening to one of my coaches coach or if I was watching something she did, but I just had this moment where I realized that, I'd been focused on mindset for so long, and it was kind of more general mindset stuff because there's so many different areas of mindset that I'm passionate about and so many things I love. And then I just had this realization that, something that a lot of women really struggle with is saying no and not feeling like crap about it. And that's something that I am super good at. So I was like, maybe I should focus a little bit more on that because if we really want to make change in the world, I feel like we have to dig into some of these places that aren't really talked about a lot.
I completely agree. I think that for far too long, women's issues and things that we were experiencing, and I always like to caveat this with I'm not saying poo-poo on men. I love my husband, love men in general, but women go through a certain set of unfortunate experiences, and it puts us on almost like a constant level of cortisol in some instances, like a constant strain on us. And I think saying no is probably one of the hardest things for us to do. I only after turning, I think I was 37 or 38, only then did I really start to that was the second time I had the aha moment of I have to set boundaries. The first time I realized I had to set boundaries and I needed to do things for myself, I was 25. And then it almost reset itself again. And I've heard from other women too, a big barrier is wanting to be people pleasing.
Yes.
And trying to, and like what you said, you're trying to mold yourself into what everyone around you is looking for, but then you're not really living your life.
Right. And I think that a big part of that comes into play with how we're raised. And you talked about kind of that distinction between men and women. And I say the same thing to people. I love men. Men are wonderful. I focus my coaching specifically on women, but I didn't start out that way. But I really started thinking about the fact that women do have a particular, obviously not every woman, there's always exceptions, but as a whole, I find that women have a particular set of challenges that seem to be symptomatic across our gender. And I think a lot of it is related to how we are socialized and some of the aspects of our culture and what we're taught about what it means to be a good woman, a good wife, a good mother, a good sister, daughter, friend, whatever it may be, and how much of that is ingrained in us from such a young age. And we don't even realize it's there. And yet it drives so much of our behavior.
So I reflect on this quite a bit because I have two daughters. I have twin girls and I have a little boy. So I have this mix in front of me that I'm like, I want everyone to be strong, articulate, independent, young people. And the girls are 7. And I've always been very cautious about phrasing and how I'm like correcting them or how I'm communicating to them across all 3 kids. But with the girls in particular, they were really little, and they might not ever remember this, but somewhere in their subliminal, in the back of their mind, it might be there. But I forget one of the twins was doing something and it was very aggressive. And I almost said, "Oh my gosh, you don't have to be so aggressive. Stop that." And then I stopped myself and was like, let's try to calm ourselves down. Like, she was doing something in particular that I was like, I don't want to say don't be aggressive because I'm like, I kind of want you to be aggressive. So I'm going to change that phrase. And so I'm just very, very cautious because I do think like as a theoretical, all of us, as you said, are socialized from young, very young. So the images that we see on TV, in movies, the books that we're being exposed to, how we're perceived, how women are perceived in media, all of that combined on a daily basis, we're being assaulted basically with this image of like, this is what you're supposed to do. And then if you don't do this, like you're not worthy of marriage, or you can't be a mom and be like this at the same time. For young women listening to this and trying to work out in their head, like, oh, well, I say no to things. Like, what would be something that you would say to someone that's like, how would I know if I have a problem saying no? Like, some people don't realize it, that they have an issue with it. What would be like a tip?
So I think one of the first things that I would look for is, are you somebody who finds yourself thinking, I never can find the time to get to my things. I never can find the time to do the things I really want to do. There's this thing I've wanted to try for a month and I can't seem to fit it into my schedule. Because that could often be a little flag waving saying, hey, what's all the stuff that's in your calendar if it's not the stuff that you want to do? And then if you start looking at it and you realize, and then another one is start really tuning into how you're feeling in situations. So you might be somebody who doesn't think you have, a problem being a people pleaser. But if you find that you're, even going to a social event and you're sitting there thinking, I'm so tired. I wish I was home on my couch. Okay, well, why aren't you home on your couch? Is it because you showed up because you felt you had to? Was there that, I'm going to miss out, someone's going to be upset with me? So sometimes it's really subtle things that we don't necessarily think to look for, but really tuning into how do I feel in different situations? Because I am a firm believer that our body tells us everything we need to know if we learn to listen to it.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you interested in podcasting but not sure where to start? My name is Jenny Benitez, and I'm here to help guide you through your podcast launch and maintenance. Check out the link in the episode description for Podcasting Unboxed, your comprehensive startup guide. I am very excited to work with you. I'm totally agree. I at about 24, 25 was when I started to really pay attention to like, what am I feeling? Do I really want to do this? Or am I just doing this because I feel obligated? Because what I started to notice, and I'm not even really sure how I ended up down this path, but I had started this self-discovery phase of my life. And I realized that like a lot of situations that I was in, I wasn't happy with it. Everyone around me was happy and I'm jumping through hoops, like supporting everybody around me. But me, myself, I was like, I'm not really happy. And this was prior to meeting my husband. And I had really at the time, I was like, I really want to meet someone. I'd like to have a partner. Like I want to eventually get married and have kids. And it just wasn't happening. And then that's when I think the moment came where I was like, well, I'm spending all my time doing everything that everyone else wants me to do. Like, I'm probably not going to meet someone like decorating for someone else's child's birthday party. Like, that's probably not. And I think that might have been like the catalyst there, because then I actually had started to focus really in on me and like what I wanted. So when I met my husband, it became like this almost like test for me. And I was like, let me just use these tools that I've learned. At the time I was reading the book, The Secret. It had just come out. It had exploded. And I took it and I was like, I'm going to try this. Like, I think this is a really good one for me. So I started seeing my husband. And as soon as I started to like prioritize things that made me happy, I noticed that the folks that had been in my like quote unquote inner circle around me started to get really angry and started to attack consistently, like on a regular basis, being like, this isn't you, this isn't who you are. This is not, this is not the person we know. Like, you're losing yourself. And the more they pressed, the more that I turned internally and really thought about that. And I'm like, well, how do I feel right now? Like, do I have that pit in my stomach that I used to have when I would be, obligated to go do something, or am I okay? And every time it came back and I was like, no, I'm happy. So if they're not happy for me, then they're probably not meant to be in alignment with my path moving forward. Like, that's where that's actually how I started to look at it.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point that you bring up, because this is, I think, one of the big fears that folks have is, I'm going to change, I'm going to set these boundaries, I'm going to say no to things, and I'm going to lose my friends and people are going to be mad at me. And there's a few different ways to look at this. And I think, one of them is that idea of, well, if they are people I lose as a result, maybe they're not the right people for this stage of my life, this phase, this path that I'm taking. But it can also be a situation where there may just be some growing pains.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is, change is really hard. Just like fundamentally for human beings, change is not an easy thing. It feels very challenging. One of the things that I find so interesting is conversations around even positive change. Feeling is so uncomfortable because we like status quo. Our brains are designed for comfort, not growth. And so it can be really uncomfortable for us to change. And it can also be really uncomfortable for other people when we change, because A, they're dealing with the change factor, and B, they're dealing with something else that I think most humans hate, which is lack of control.
Yes.
So you put those two things together and it's like, oh, I'm trying to navigate the two most uncomfortable feelings in the world. And there's this person in front of me who I think I know really well. And suddenly I'm questioning if I know them as well as I thought, because they're acting differently and I don't know what to do. And unfortunately, in a lot of situations, that discomfort comes across as they're mad at us. Yeah. They are upset. We have done something wrong. When in reality, it's just they may need help navigating this journey as well. And so I feel like the right people will be able to navigate that discomfort with you and come out the other side. And I am a believer that those who don't or can't, it's worth maybe evaluating, if they still belong in your life, what role they need to play.
That was exactly my experience. And so anyone who's listening to this, yes, it feels odd in the it feels painful in the moment, and it even feels off to use in some instances, because as Becky had said, our brains are not wired for change. Like, we are actually not set up for that. I read a book by Dr. Joe Dispenza, where he talks through like the wiring in your brain. And I had to read this section of the book like 4 times because it took a minute. he writes
brain science is tough, I will tell you.
It was tough. And I try to like pride myself on being like smart and being able to intelligence and everything. And this was like, it took me a minute. It took me a while. And but I read this portion of his book where he talks through like that uncomfortable feeling that you're having is actually your brain rewiring itself. So like on any given day or any given year, you're doing the same things over and over again. And your body is wired to react emotionally the same exact way each time. And this is our comfort level. We're used to going through the same thing over and over again. Status quo, exactly what you said. if you decide to change something in your status quo, your brain, it's almost like, think about train tracks, and you have now tried to make a change. So you've shifted the track and created a new set of tracks. And so your brain, little conductor, is like, why am I going down this path? I've only made a right here. Why is there now a fork in the road? And so your brain has to adjust to this new path. What I've recently experienced in the past year, after gaining this knowledge, is that each time I was on the precipice of good change or something that was really pushing me towards growth is when I was the most uncomfortable and when I was the most scared, to be perfectly honest. But if you can just push past that point, then the rewards are many. And I'm not saying like, oh, it's like prizes, but like your life trajectory can change for the better because you're pushing yourself into alignment with what you're actually supposed to be in alignment with.
Right. And I love that you bring that up. I actually had a conversation years ago with a friend of mine. I refer to her as my wise counsel. She is the person that I go to when I need perspective and wisdom. And we were having a conversation once, and I don't even remember what it was about, but somehow the topic of discomfort came up. And I said, well, that's where all the good stuff happens.
Mm-hmm.
And she kind of had that, aha moment of like, oh yeah, like hadn't really thought about it that way. But, it at the end of the day, growth is not always a linear process, and it certainly doesn't feel easy. But I think that's part of why it's so rewarding, because it's like you said, it's the prize on the other side is being able to come out the other side and have the ability to really, I love to use the phrasing, how I show up in the world for myself and for others, because I think that, again, as women, so many of us are socialized to focus on how we show up in the world for others. And I actually think it is just as important, in fact, more so, to show up well for ourselves. Because I would argue that if I am not showing up for myself, then I am not showing up well for you, even if I think I am.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's all these epiphanies that happened around me turning 40, by the way. Like when I was leading up to turning 40, I had all these like really major epiphanies. Mm-hmm. And I kept saying to people, I'm like, it's because I'm turning 40. It's like the golden age for me.
It's a good period of time, I will tell you.
Like, I don't know why everyone's so scared. This is awesome. This is wonderful. But it's true. You go through these periods where, you are questioning yourself, you're questioning what you're doing. And it is that uncomfortability that really does push you into the next level. And I'll use the podcast as an example too, because the first like it's funny because I know other podcasters that do the exact same thing. The first few episodes or first like, I don't know, couple months of episodes that I would post episodes, I would literally like post it into my system, and then I would like slam the computer and like run away from the computer because I was like so nervous of the fact that I'm putting myself out there. And I've actually had people say that to me, like, I could never do that because you're really putting yourself out there. And it's interesting because in the beginning it was scary, and now I'm like, if I had never pushed that door open, I wouldn't have met like you and all these phenomenal women that are coming onto the podcast, and I wouldn't be able to help share everyone's stories and all this great work that everybody's doing. Because, you yourself just said, like, you originally you weren't focused just on women, but now you are. And it's so crucial, especially for today's day and age, for us to have a really strong sense of ourselves and like what's driving us, because there's so much noise because of social media that it honestly is scary to think about the amount of people that get lost because of what they're seeing online.
Absolutely. And you kind of touched on that, approaching 40, you're coming into 40. And I hear that from a lot of women that like, I did start to feel like I was getting more confident in my 40s, but, maybe still have some work to do. But I definitely think there is something about turning 40. And, I go back and forth about, is it that whole, as we get older and we get wiser, hopefully, and we learn some things and we realize what matters and what doesn't. But I also think that may be kind of the age we get to where we start to see that the narrative that we've been sold our whole lives has some flaws. Mm-hmm. And I think about, growing up, and it's like, oh, for me, it was like, go to school and get a good job. And it's like
Yep.
you were talking about, it's like find a guy, get married, have a family. And how many, women either end up not going down that path because they
Hmm.
don't find the partner or their life isn't, or they take that path and it's like, okay, I'm doing the things, I'm checking the boxes, I'm checking the boxes. And it's kind of like you're always waiting
For something.
for what comes on the other side.
Yeah.
And then nothing comes. And I think by the time you hit 40, you're like, I just am like, I'm at 40. Like, when's it coming? Like, it's one thing when I'm 20 and it's like, well, I've got a long way to go. And then you hit 40 and you're like, this is like half my life, maybe more, come on. Where's the prize? Where's the other side of? And I think that's when we start realizing that, life isn't a bunch of check boxes to get us
Mhm.
to a destination. I remember when I was a teenager, a friend of mine had this book and it was called The Journey is the Destination.
Hmm.
And I just love that phrase and it stuck with me for my whole life that like we think about we're doing all of these things to get to a destination. The destination is death. So if you're doing all of this stuff to get to the end, well, what happens at the end is that we all die.
Yeah.
So rather than working to get to the destination, I feel like we need to start focusing on the journey, right? And we don't have to wait till we're 40 to do that. We can start doing that whenever.
You kind of like blew my mind a little bit just now with what you just said because this is so let me back up for a second in my head because I got really excited. I had similar upbringing. It was like go to school, go to college, get a job. For me, it was like get a corporate job. You need to make money, like
Stability, get a pension if you can
stability,
do it.
climb the ladder, work 80 hours a week, kill yourself for the job. Like that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to kill yourself for the job. And I did kill myself for the job. Like I was the girl who got up and was in the office at 7 and then didn't leave until 7 at night. Like that was like, and I was proud of it. And I wore my burnout like a badge of honor. Like this is great.
Yes.
This is what I'm supposed to be doing.
And I will tell
And
you, that is one of my biggest pet peeves in life because I think far too many women do that. And I'm like, let's stop normalizing that.
oh, we have to, and the what's crazy is that the agency that I had joined when I was fresh out of college, they actually like advocated for burnout. And they literally used to say, like, this was what I was told when I was hired. This is your first project that you're working on, XYZ. Here you go. Like handed me the stuff. I have no idea what's what. And then it was like, yeah, we like to do trial by fire. And I was like,
Wow.
okay. And I didn't know what that meant, but that was my first learning. And then I was with them for about 4.5 years, roughly. Well, I took that attitude with me when I left. And for a lot of years, I was like, well, if you can't succeed at this, I don't know what to tell. Like, and I was not like I was pleasant to work with, but not really because I was one of those people that was like, oh, you have time to take lunch? Well, then you have more time for more projects. Like I should give you more work to do. Like that was the mentality. And it's so horrendous because it took me a really long time. I don't think I even got past it until I was like early 30s. And then I was like, this is not how you're supposed to be working with people. And it took me many years to pull back from that. And I still know people to this day that still work in that way. And I'm like, you don't have to do that though. Like, why do we feel the need to do that? There's that. And there's also this underlying pressure for women to like attack each other in the workplace. And I don't mean physically, you know what I mean? Like, oh, well, I can't help, I can't, advocate for my fellow female colleagues because then there's not enough for me. Like, that's not there. Like that rhetoric is set up for us to be like haggling with each other when we should really be trying to elevate each other and lift each other up.
Yeah. And that's a narrative that is perpetuated in our culture so deeply that, there's not a lot of space at the table.
Yep.
And I love the expression that people talk about, instead of trying to determine who is going to get the last seat at the table, why don't we just go out and buy a bigger table?
Yeah.
And I think about, there's the story of somebody asking Ruth Bader Ginsburg, well, when is it going to be enough? When is it going to be enough to have, what is enough women on the court? And she said, when it's all of them. And the person was appalled by that. And she was like, but it's funny. Nobody was appalled when it was just men.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea of something being all female is like shocking and,
Shocking.
counterculture,
Terrifying.
which tells you what our culture perpetuates, right? And
Mhm.
so I think it is that idea of, if I'm a woman, especially in like a corporate space where maybe it's a male dominated space, and I believe that there's a scarcity situation, I think a lot of us are taught we have to compete in order to get that spot. I will tell you, for me, when I see women who are very competitive and very combative with other women, what I feel is I look at that person and I say, it must be difficult to feel that insecure.
Yes.
Because I think that when you are truly confident and you truly know what you bring to the table, you don't have to compete with anyone.
Mm-hmm.
I always make the joke, I said, if somebody ever asks me what I bring to the table, I just look at them and say, I bring the damn table. Um, because I'm going to go into a situation confident, knowing what I have to offer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it ties back to that idea of saying no. I had somebody ask me recently about saying no at work, and, well, you can't say no at work. And I think so many of us think we can't say no at work because, again, we think our value is tied to how many hours we work or how much burnout. But I would argue that, I remember many years ago, I had a colleague that worked insane hours, and it was like, oh, this person works like 12-hour days. And finally I said to somebody, I said, I don't know that person. I don't know their situation. I said, but has anybody also ever asked, like, maybe it's not that that person is very dedicated. Maybe it's that that person is very inefficient, because that could also be true, right? But we just assume, oh, you work 12-hour days, 6 days a week, you must be really dedicated. Well, not necessarily. So I think just kind of questioning these narratives that we've been fed, that we've bought into, and like, hey, maybe I don't need to work 80 hours a week, because what I accomplish in 40 is better than what other people do at 80, right? And building that confidence in ourselves and recognizing what we bring to the table, whether it be in work, in relationships, as a parent, as a friend, and really trusting that who we are and the way that we show up is our value, and that we don't have to jump through hoops to get approval to define our worth.
I had gone on like a bit of a, professional journey, as I mentioned, and it's very in line with like what you're saying. And it started when I was about like 37-ish or whatever. And I had gotten put on this project and I didn't have capacity for it. And I was like, I can't support this project. Like I don't have enough time. I can't do it. I have too much other things. And I got put on it anyway. I all of a sudden just was on it. I was just getting emails and they were like, Jenny, do this. And I was like, I said, I can't do this. So it was like, I said no, but they didn't listen. So I went through this whole period for about 3 weeks or so where I was working 12, 15-hour days, and my kids were very little at the time. And, my husband, thank bless him, was he had slowed down his work. So like he had stopped working during COVID, and then he was stay-at-home dad so that I could do my profession. Like he knew how important it was to me. And so he was handling the kids, and I would come out to like make breakfast and do baths or whatever. And then I would go back into my office, and it was like constant because I worked from home. And at the end of the 3 weeks, I was like, had this epiphany, almost breakdown moment of like, I haven't seen my kids and they look bigger now. And I lost 3 weeks. I'm like, can't get it back. And after that happened, I realized I was like, that was the thing that really pushed me to be like, I have to stop this now, because for me, it was my kids. For other people, it might be something else that is your moment of like, I'm sacrificing myself for my job. But at the end of the day here, I'm just a number. I am completely replaceable. And just killing yourself for your job is not really going to get you anywhere, because if you were to die today, if you are one of these folks that's a workaholic, like how I used to be, if you were to die today, your job is going to be posted within 24 hours, 48 hours. They're going to hire someone to replace you. They're not going to do anything. So after I had this period where I was like crazy at work, I found out through another colleague that a former colleague of mine had died. She was only in her early 40s. She worked herself to death. She was a workaholic, constantly in the office. didn't go to the doctor when she was sick, with just over the counter medicines. And by the time she died, she was, again, early 40s, about where I'm at right now.
Oh.
And she was leaving her house and she dropped dead on her front lawn because she had a urinary tract infection that backed up into her kidneys. And then she ended up going septic. She never addressed it. She just kept powering through. And I found out about that. And then after what I had just gone through, and I was like, I have to make a change here. So at my current place of work, when I was interviewing, I said, I was like, I don't do travel. And I need to be able to, from 3:30 to 4:30, like block my calendar because I have to get my kids off the bus from school. I'm like, I'm not going to rush it. I'm not going to rush them. I'm not going to compromise myself. Like, I need to set these boundaries. Becky, for the first 6 months of the job, had to consistently remind people, I cannot get on a call with you from 3:30 to 4:30. That was probably the hardest thing professionally as a woman, as a mother, like having to constantly tell people, no, but I can meet you tomorrow morning, or we can meet earlier in the day, but I cannot do it at that time. It was very difficult. And it was because of that constant need to have to tell them, like, no, can't do it. And then I even had a recent situation where, even though all this history that I have, and I know that setting the boundary is important, where I was asked to do something, work-related travel, and I had to say, I was like, I can't do that. My kids are young. Like, I have to be here. This is the line that I've drawn, and I'm sticking with it. And even with all the knowledge that I have, I still am uncomfortable with it. I do it, but I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing. We sometimes underestimate how uncomfortable we're going to feel. But again, when it's so normalized to say yes, and it's so normalized to, oh, well, you don't want to be the person at work who's not the team player. You don't want to be the one person who's not staying late, or the one person who's not in the meeting. But again, I think a lot of that balance is, the fact that you were very upfront about, this is what I am willing to do and not do.
Yeah.
I think there are some people who would say, well, I can't do that. I won't get the job. Well, you're proof that that's untrue. Right. And so I think the more evidence we can collect that some of these things that we have been taught to believe are just simply untrue, the easier it becomes to take the chances and to start. I always give the analogy of, it's like a muscle. The more you do something, the more comfortable you get with it. I joke all the time that my favorite word is no. And, I love saying yes to people and things, but the reason I love saying no is because I fundamentally believe that every time you say no to something that you do not want, whether it be something you don't want in your life, something you don't want to do, or something that does not serve you, it creates space for saying yes to things that do.
Oh, I like that.
I feel like everything in life is a balance, right? So if I'm saying yes to 5 things I don't want to do, that's 5 things I do want to do that I now have to say no to, right? So it's like, I have to say no to my things to make space for your things. Or I say no to your things or society's things or whoever's. And then those are things that I can now bring in that I want to cultivate in my life.
I haven't heard of it. I haven't heard that articulated in that way before, but that makes a lot of sense, because if you're saying yes to everyone else's things, like if I only have Saturday and Sunday free to myself and I'm saying yes to everybody else, that means that I have no time for my things, which I will say, I did know, like this past year, I was making it like a very serious mission of mine to be trying not to do that, and putting myself in positions where I was like committing to things that I knew I was going to be upset about or frustrated with. And one thing that I did commit to is that on the weekends that I am having time where I am just like hanging out with my family. And that sounds like, oh, well, Jenny, just like hang out with your family. But I have always had this thing where I couldn't sit down and relax and watch a movie because I have to do the dishes, or I have to clean I have to do the laundry. I have to fold the laundry. Oh, but if I don't fold the laundry now, but then I have to get dinner on the table. And if I don't get dinner on the table, well, that's going to push baths back. And then and it was like this constant like pressing of like, oh no, you have to constantly be doing all the things. And again, only in the past year have I started to really recognize, like, you don't have to do that. You can actually sit down and like play games with your kids and go in the pool. What the Becky, we moved into our home in 2022, and the first year that we were here where the pool was open, I went in the pool maybe 5 times in the whole year because I was constantly working.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would get off of work and I would start dinner right away. And then it would be bath time, and then it would be this and this, and it would just snowball. And I literally, and somebody asked me, "Oh, you must be in the pool all the time." And I was like, "No, I'm not." I was like, "This is terrible." I'm like, "I'm no fun." This is horrible. What we talked about, there's obviously, saying no is an issue, fear and guilt for women.
Mm-hmm.
That's like loads to unpack, but like in your work, what are you seeing fear of and guilt with the most?
So the fear is rejection.
Okay.
And we don't necessarily see it as rejection, but that's how I see it. And I think it's really, again, it really goes back so far into not even just for women, how we're socialized, but back to like the origins of human survival. When you think about how people survived, and you couldn't survive on your own, right? You had to be part of a community. You had to be part of a group. And if you were living in a community and that community ostracized you, you most likely weren't going to survive on your own in early days of, existence. Obviously now, life is very different. But when you think back to like how we evolved in community with one another, we are foundationally designed to live in community with other people. And so even though in 2024, when we're having this conversation, if one of my friends ostracizes me, I'm not going to die from it, right? I'm not it's not like, oh, I've been thrown out into the wilderness on my own with no food or water or weapons, and there's wild animals ready to eat me. That's not the scenario, unless I'm doing something really weird with my friends and it goes awry, But the way we experience things is, oh my gosh, I'm in danger. I am going to lose that community. I'm going to lose that connection. Like, we are wired for human connection. So the fear is really that rejection, that if I say no, if I set this boundary and that person gets upset because again, most of us, if we've set boundaries and we've said no, have had the experience of somebody kind of bristling at it.
Yeah.
So then it's like, oh, well, I know they're going to get upset with me. And then what happens? So it's that fear of rejection. It's that fear of losing that community and not being accepted and not being a part of things. The other piece of it, the guilt, I think, goes back to our identities. Just listening to you talk about, coming home and not using the pool because it's like, well, I've got to get dinner started and we don't want to mess up the bath schedule. And that makes perfect sense to me, hearing you say it. And I bet you it would make perfect sense to every woman listening to this conversation. And yet, I think the average man would be like, well, why don't you just give the bath late? Or like, well, why does dinner have to be at a certain time, right? And not because they don't care, but because they were socialized differently.
Yes.
They see their roles. Like, I don't know your husband at all, but I imagine he probably doesn't sit there and think about what time the bath and the dinner. And it's just not how men are programmed or wired or raised in our society as a whole. And so I think that's where the guilt comes in. It's, I have to, and that's, you'd asked earlier about kind of signs that maybe we need to set some boundaries. And one of the things, if you find yourself using language either to friends or to yourself of, I have to, I need to, right? I do that one a lot. It's like, oh, well, I need to do this thing. And it's like, do I really need that? Or am I just using that verbiage because it's something that I don't actually want to do? And maybe it's somebody else's stuff or stuff that I've made my stuff that I don't actually want to be my stuff.
It's, I haven't talked through any of this in a really long time, and it's interesting to refresh my memory on all of it because I've been on the journey for so long. But the socialization is interesting to observe between little boys and little girls, and I see it with my kids. And as much as like my husband and I, we're very active communicators. So we talk our kids through everything, even when they get in trouble, like if they, if you yell at them or whatever, we talk to them post and we're like, okay, this is what happened. Let's, talk through this and everything. So they're all getting raised pretty similarly. Like that's all happening the right way. But for some reason, my son feels that he needs to be the in charge, like the leader. And I know that he's picking things up for my husband, which is very cute to see, like him taking on this I'm the man role. But in my house it's a bit of an issue because I also am teaching the girls, like, you are leaders too. Like, we're leaders here, we're not followers. And the amount of stress this causes my son, because he wants so badly to be like, this is it and this is how it is, and the girls are like, no, I will not do that. and so now we're teaching them tools to like work with someone in that scenario. Like, okay, well, if he doesn't want to do this or he's not listening to you, because they'll come to me and be like, oh, he's not listening or he's not, doing what I'm asking him to do. I tell them like, well, it's okay to move on. Like you might want him to, but if he doesn't want to, like, you can only control yourself. You can't control other people. That was also a big lesson for me that I had to learn. And so now, like, everything, let me tell you, Becky, everything that I learned in the past, like 5 years, I'm trying to make sure that my kids get all that now at 7 and 8, because for a really long time, I would get incredibly stressed out about what other people were doing and the need to like control and be like, oh, well, I'll set all this up and I'll do this and, just show up and me like articulate, like having to make sure everything was running exactly how I saw. It's taken like years for me to like let go of that and to let go of that ego control where I'm like, oh, I'm all the way at the top of the tower now and I'm in control of all the things and it can't run without me. Just can't. But it can run without me. Everyone else can do it. I don't have to be stressed out. And I, could get like less wrinkles this way. That's how I'm
right. The world will keep on turning, right? Yes. If we don't show up for a day. And I think that that's such an important point, as is that idea of control, because I will tell you, that is one of the things that I want everybody to understand about setting a boundary. I think there are so many people that have been taught or have somehow learned or come to understand boundaries as a boundary is something I do to get another person to behave a certain way or stop behaving a certain way. And that is not, in fact, what a boundary is. And if you set a boundary thinking, I'm going to say or do this thing so that the other person, just stop right there. Because you can set a boundary and tell that person, I don't like it when you do this. And if you do this, here's going to be your consequence, quote unquote. And that person can smile and say, okay, and then just keep doing that thing over and over and over again. And so we have to really think about, what do I need for myself to be at peace? What do I need for myself? Again, it goes back to, how do I want to show up for myself and in the world? And what boundaries do I need to set to show up in that way? How do I want to make peace in this situation? And really make it about us, not in a selfish way, but in I am the only person I have control over way. And I am the worst that I will remember things. And it's like, I remember part of the quote, but I don't remember who said it. So there's a quote that I'm fairly certain was said either by Elizabeth Gilbert or Brene Brown. And the gist of the quote is about having control. And it's like, thinking that if I just do these things that I can, get control back, or I can have control. But what we don't realize is we never had control. We just had anxiety. And I think that's such a perfect thing for so many women, is we spend so much time trying to kind of manipulate the situation, trying to be the overseer of all things, to streamline all things, to take on all the things, to make sure they go the way we want them to make sure things go smoothly, thinking that if we do all the things and we do all the things right, then everything will go exactly as we had planned and we will have control. But we never have control. We just are creating anxiety for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we see that so much with women, where it's like, why do I feel anxious all the time? And it's like, because you feel like you are responsible for the entire world.
Mm-hmm.
And I will never forget, many years ago, I was having a conversation with someone, and we were kind of talking about feeling the weight of the world. And the person was like, I don't know why you feel like you're responsible. And basically what I said to them, I said, it's like that line from the Bible, those to whom much has been given, much is expected. And I said, I feel like I'm somebody who's been given a lot, and I'm somebody who's been blessed a lot. And so I feel like I owe a lot in return, if that makes sense. Like because I've been given so much, it is incumbent upon me to step up. And I said, and sometimes it just feels like I have the weight of the world on my shoulders, like I'm responsible for everything and everyone all the time. And I just remember the person saying, wow, that sounds really exhausting.
Yeah.
And I think about how many women, and I was, I think, in my 20s when that conversation happened, but I think how many women could be having that conversation in their 20s or their 30s or their 40s. There are women who are way past their 40s who I think still, struggle with some of this. And it really is, take all of those things that we've been taught and all of those assumptions that we make about how we can maintain control and how our being more involved gives us more safety or gives us more of the outcomes we want. And it's scary to kind of acknowledge that might not be true. Like, I can show up fully, I can try to manipulate the situation, and I may not get what I want. But I think it can also be very freeing to realize that. And that, I can just show up the way I want to, not the way I think I have to.
Well, because the reality of it is that if you're not showing up authentically, then you're creating a whole course that is not really meant to be. And if you're not showing up authentically and you're showing up how you think you need to show up and you're controlling things how you think that they should be controlled, then you're not leaving yourself that space for the what if it aligns for me. And, when you show up, when I started really, really being myself and really being true to like, what does Jenny want here? How is Jenny feeling about this situation? When I started doing meditations daily and affirmations, I have my kids doing affirmations every night. Like, Becky,
I love it.
It's like real here. Without all those tools of like affirmations, visualizations, meditation, like journaling, reading, expanding the mind a little bit, like without all those tools, I would be I don't even know what place I would be in right now. I'd still probably be in this house, but like mentally, I don't think I would be in a good headspace, because when I was on the path where I was controlling everything, I wasn't in a good headspace. And my kids used to tell me, like, Mommy, like, why do you look so sad all the time? Why are you always mad? Mommy screams a lot. Mommy, one of the girls said to me the one time, and it like crushed me, as children's words usually do. She said something to the effect of like, we're not good enough. That's why you yell at us. Yep. And I was like, oh God. I was like, oh my God. And it was in that brief time that I told you where I was like really stressed out, and my work was like totally out of whack, and I had no boundaries set, and I was doing all the things. Well, I was showing up as like a terrible human person, in my opinion, in comparison to what I could be, because I wasn't filling my cup, and I was just taking and filling everything else for everybody else and trying to control all the things. And it did no good for me or my family. So it's incredibly important for women to get on board with this and really start looking into, in my opinion, coaching and partnering with somebody. And I mean, I have accountability partners that I reach out to when I'm feeling like kind of low, and I'm like, hey, like, do you want to chat real quick? Like, I could, and what's really funny is like 9 times out of 10, they reply and they're like, oh my God, me too. I really need to talk. Like, let's just like,
right.
So really none of us this is not unique to me. This is not unique to Becky. This is all of us going through this. We're all in the same boat. we need to start reaching out to each other and supporting each other and talking to each other. And then Becky has this wonderful skill set. She could actually guide you in what tools to use, because there is a lot of misinformation out there. So, it's not just like, oh, you're just thinking happy thoughts. Like, there's a lot more to it. Like, you ever see those? It actually kind of irritates me now when I see posts that are just like, think happy and it's that simple. And I'm like, well, it's not that simple. It's part of it, but it's not all of it.
Well, it's funny. I'm chuckling because my best friend and I were having a conversation the other day about toxic positivity.
Yep.
And one of the things that I take great pride in, and I was talking about with somebody else last week, was one of the best compliments I got as a coach from someone was, you know what I like about you? They're like, you're a life coach, but you're not one of those life coaches that's just like, oh, everything's wonderful, life is amazing. And I was like, yeah, because like life can be really hard. And that's the thing, is pretending that things are not difficult doesn't make them better.
No.
What makes them better is saying, this situation feels difficult. How do I navigate it? And how do I navigate it in a way that feels better for me? Not like, well, I'm just going to pretend it's great until it becomes great. Like there are things in life that are going to feel difficult. And that's just kind of how life works. I think sometimes people have this idea that, oh, when you figure things out and you get life together and you get tools, that everything is great all the time. And it's like, no, you just have tools to navigate when things are great and when things are not. And I think to your point, the willingness to talk about these things, the willingness to be open, to be present. I remember years and years ago talking to my sister, and I was supposed to go on a date, and I had gotten stood up. And I just had I didn't think that was a real thing that happened. I thought it was like something that happened in the movies, like a bad plot line on a sitcom, I was like crying, not even over the person. I think it was like, I just was so shocked and hurt and just all the things. And I call and I'm talking to my sister about it. And she's like, I just wouldn't think about it anymore. Just like go home, get some rest. Cause I had pulled over in like a McDonald's parking lot. And I'm crying and talking to my sister. And I said, I'm going to do that. I'm going to like delete his number and not think about it anymore. I was like, as soon as I go live and talk about it to strangers on the internet. And she was like, I'm sorry, what are you about to do? And I was like, well, here's the thing. I was like, this is really sucky.
Yeah.
And I didn't think it was something that happened until my then business coach at the time, who used to be a dating coach, talked about, well, when my dating coach clients would get stood up. And I was like, wait, this is like a thing that happens all the time? Like, I had no idea. And how many people don't know that? And how many people need to hear this message? And it was not, going on camera with cry face, not my finest moment, I'm sure, but also the willingness to share our experiences. And obviously it's a little bit different when you do this work professionally. And I'm a firm believer of, as a coach, you are asking people to be very vulnerable and open with you. And so while certainly it's not the same relationship going in the opposite direction, I do think that as coaches, we need to be willing to share things and not always put our best face forward, and to acknowledge that like, hey, like my life is not perfect. No one's life is perfect. I always argue, if you have somebody that tells you that everything in their life is perfect, I personally would be very suspect of that.
Yeah, that's actually pretty suspicious. It's not possible. And I love that. I love what you just said too, because I think that's also part of the apprehension with folks seeking out coaches, because, well, one, they're like, a life coach, like what kind of dummy am I? I can't figure this out. It's like, okay, first of all, everybody needs help. Like, raise your hand. Like, let's do this. Like, you want to knock this out of the park. Like, find somebody like Becky or find Becky. And, so that's one thing, the vulnerability factor and sharing the stories. I mean, clearly that's what this podcast was founded on. It was founded on the fact that I was really struggling as a mom and as a professional combined. And I was like, there has to be other women going through the same thing. I want to start to affect change. I want people to hear these stories. I want people to be in touch with other women, to hear other women's stories. And there's quite a few guests that actually have come on that have gone through some significant, massive trauma, and they actually turned it into something where I'm like, you know what? I'm going to share my story. I'm going to help other people. A lot of women are doing it now, and they're coming to this podcast, which is like blowing my mind because that's what this was created for. I just did
Awesome.
I just did an episode, recently. And like the next day, one of the guests for the fall said to me, she was like, I'm so glad you posted that episode. It was so raw. And essentially on the episode, I like kind of broke down a little bit, but I also, I was like, I'm having a tough time and I don't want anyone to get the perception that this is easy. Like I work full time, I podcast almost full time. And then I have my kids and my husband and my house and like everything else that I'm supposed to be carrying, to do. And I'm like, it's not easy, and I don't want anyone to ever get the misperception that it's like, oh, everything's perfect. And this, and I'm like, no, hell no, definitely not. So I'm so glad you said that because your coaching style is what's sorely needed because it's real. Like this is real. You're not sitting here saying like everything's perfect and it's sunshine and rainbows coming out of everything all the time. Like, no, like it's a real way to approach life. And you're providing the tools for folks to actually be able to, like you said, manage things as they come. Becky, I could probably talk to you for like 6 more hours. I just want you to know.
I know. I just saw the time and I was like, oh my gosh.
I know. Listeners, I'm going to link all of Becky's things, all her content, wherever you can reach Becky. It's going to be linked in the description of the podcast. Becky, thank you so much for coming on. I greatly appreciate it. And I think the listeners will appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun. And I feel like we have a lot of synergy. And so it's always good to talk to somebody like-minded who it's like, they get it.
I get excited. Well, listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this episode. And we'll see you on the next one.